I never expected to go to war with my Homeowners Association. But as I stood in my front yard facing a man with a fake badge, I realized that's exactly what was happening. "Sir, I'm going to need you to come with me," he said, his hand hovering near his waistband where I could see what looked like a holstered gun. "You've violated multiple HOA regulations, and we're placing you under citizen's arrest." My name is Flynn Hayes, and until 6 months ago, I'd been living peacefully in Oakwood Estates, a suburban neighborhood in Austin, Texas. I'd bought my modest 3-bedroom home after my divorce, looking for a quiet place to rebuild my life. The HOA fees seemed reasonable for the well-maintained community, and I'd barely given the association a second thought until Patricia Stevenson took over as president. "You can't be serious," I said, staring at the man who had identified himself as Officer Williams of Oakwood Estates Security. He wore what looked like a police uniform, but something was off. The badge was similar to a sheriff's deputy badge, but the emblem was clearly not official. "The HOA doesn't have arrest powers. Who exactly are you?" "I don't have to explain myself to you," Williams replied, reaching for my arm. "Now, you can either come quietly or we can make this difficult." I stepped back, pulling my phone from my pocket. "I'm calling the actual police." Williams lunged forward, trying to grab my phone. I dodged backward, nearly tripping over my garden hose. The confrontation had started over something ridiculous. I'd painted my mailbox navy blue instead of the HOA-approved midnight blue. Patricia had sent me 3 violation notices in the past week, each with escalating fines. "Put your hands behind your back," Williams shouted, now pulling what appeared to be actual handcuffs from his belt. Neighbors were starting to peek through windows and step onto porches, watching the scene unfold. "This is insane," I said, backing toward my front door. "I'm going inside." "If you have an issue, have the HOA contact me through proper channels." That's when he drew his gun. I said, "Stop," Williams yelled, pointing the weapon at me. My blood turned to ice. Over a mailbox. This couldn't be happening. I raised my hands slowly, mind racing. Okay, let's calm down." Thankfully, my neighbor, Howard Martin, had already called 911. Within minutes, we heard sirens approaching. Williams looked nervous but maintained his position, gun still pointed at me. 2 Travis County Sheriff's Department cruisers pulled up, and deputies quickly assessed the situation, ordering Williams to drop his weapon. When he hesitated, they drew their own guns. "Drop it now," one deputy commanded. Williams finally complied, and they quickly had him in handcuffs. Sheriff Damon Reynolds arrived shortly after, a tall man with a weathered face and no patience for nonsense. He examined Williams' badge and uniform while deputies secured the scene. "This is a fake badge," Reynolds said, holding it up. "And impersonating a police officer is a 3rd-degree felony in Texas," Williams tried to explain. "I work for Oakwood Security, hired by the HOA. I was just doing my job." Reynolds looked unimpressed. "Oakwood Security? There's no licensed security company by that name in Travis County." He turned to one of his deputies. "Check if he has a license to carry that firearm." He didn't. And as it turned out, Officer Williams was actually Kevin Williams, a former mall security guard with no law enforcement credentials and a record of petty theft. He'd been hired by Patricia Stevenson without any background check. That afternoon at the sheriff's office, I gave my statement while still trying to process what had happened. A deputy explained that this wasn't the first complaint about our HOA, but it was definitely the most serious. "Mr. Hayes," Sheriff Reynolds said, sitting down across from me, "this goes beyond an HOA dispute. We've got impersonating a law enforcement officer, unlawful carrying of a weapon, Aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, these are serious felony charges. But I'm concerned there's more to this story. What do you mean? I asked. We've received multiple complaints about your HOA in recent months: excessive fines, harassment, selective enforcement of rules, but nothing that crossed into criminal territory until today. He leaned forward. Would you be willing to help us investigate further? I thought about my quiet life, how all I'd wanted was peace after my divorce. But I also thought about my neighbor's elderly Mrs. Patel, who'd been fined $500 because her roses grew 2 inches above regulation height. The Rodriguez family, who'd received daily notices when their son's bicycle was visible in their driveway. Henry Allen, who'd nearly lost his house after the HOA placed a lien on it over disputed fines. Yes, I said, I'll help. What followed was a crash course in HOA law and the beginning of what my neighbors would later call the Oakwood Rebellion. The next morning, I woke to frantic knocking on my door. I opened it to find Hannah Adams, a neighbor from 2 streets over who I knew casually from community events. Flynn, have you seen this? She thrust a piece of paper into my hands. It was an emergency HOA notice calling for a special meeting that evening to discuss recent security breaches and criminal elements in our community. Hannah tucked a strand of auburn hair behind her ear, looking worried. They're going to try to spin what happened yesterday. Patricia's already been calling board members. Hannah worked as a paralegal at a law firm specializing in real estate law. We'd spoken a few times at community events, but had never really connected beyond pleasantries. Now, she seemed determined to help. How do you know this? I asked. My boss represents 3 other HOAs where Patricia served on the board before moving here. There were issues, she hesitated, financial discrepancies, nothing that could be proven but enough that they asked her to resign. This was interesting information, so she has a history. Hannah nodded. And now she's using the HOA as her personal power trip. Did you know they've increased the budget for security measures by 300% this year? I hadn't known. Like most residents, I'd skimmed the annual budget when it arrived and noted the modest increase in dues without examining the details. The meeting tonight, we need to be prepared, Hannah said. Patricia will try to justify what happened to you. She'll probably even try to blame you. She was right. At 7 p.m., the community center was packed. Patricia Stevenson stood at the front, immaculately dressed in a blue blazer, her blonde bob perfectly styled. Beside her sat the 4 other board members, looking uncomfortable. Thank you all for coming on such short notice, Patricia began, her voice steady. As you may have heard, we had an unfortunate incident yesterday involving our security contractor and a resident who has consistently violated our community standards. Murmurs spread through the room. I felt eyes turning toward me where I stood at the back wall. Our security personnel may have been overzealous in his approach, Patricia continued, but I want to assure everyone that the board's priority is maintaining property values and community safety. Mr. Hayes has repeatedly ignored citations for a mailbox, I called out, unable to stay silent. And your security personnel pulled a gun on me. Patricia's smile tightened. We do not condone that action, which is why we've terminated our contract with that particular individual. However, Hannah stood up. Patricia, I'd like to address something more concerning. I've reviewed the HOA financial records, which as a homeowner I'm entitled to do. She held up a folder. Can you explain why $175,000 was transferred to Oakwood Security Services over the past 3 months, when this company was only registered as an LLC 6 months ago and has no other clients or history? The room fell silent. Patricia's composure slipped for a moment before she recovered. Our security needs have increased, and the board approved these expenditures unanimously. Board member Richard Tanner spoke up, looking confused. I don't recall approving that amount, Patricia. We agreed to a trial security program for $30,000. What followed was chaos. Other homeowners began asking questions about missing funds, selective enforcement, and whether the board had known their security was armed. Patricia tried to regain control, eventually calling the meeting to an end without addressing most questions. As people filed out, Sheriff Reynolds, who had been standing quietly in the corner taking notes, approached Patricia. "Miss Stevenson, I'd like to speak with you about Kevin Williams and Oakwood Security Services," he said. "Perhaps we could continue this conversation at the sheriff's office." Patricia's face went pale. "I need to speak with my attorney." "That would be wise," Reynolds agreed. In the parking lot afterward, Hannah showed me what she'd found in the financial records. Oakwood Security Services LLC listed Patricia's sister as the registered agent. Nearly $200,000 of HOA funds had been paid to the company, but there was no evidence of security patrols or services before Williams showed up at my door. "This is embezzlement," Hannah said, "and that's just what I could find with a quick look." Over the next week, the investigation expanded rapidly. Sheriff Reynolds obtained warrants for the HOA's complete financial records. The county prosecutor's office became involved. Kevin Williams, facing multiple felony charges, decided to cooperate in exchange for potential leniency. What he revealed was shocking. Patricia had specifically instructed him to target certain homeowners, those who had questioned her authority, or who owned desirable properties that had resisted pressure to sell to a developer with whom she had connections. "She told me to intimidate you specifically," Williams admitted during an interview that Reynolds let me observe. "Said you were becoming a problem and needed to be taught a lesson." "And the gun?" I asked. "Was that your idea or hers?" Williams looked down. "She told me to look authoritative." I took that too far, but she knew I carried it. Meanwhile, our community was in turmoil. Some residents defended Patricia, arguing that strict enforcement maintained our property values. Others shared stories of harassment and excessive fines. The divide grew deeper when we discovered that certain homes belonging to Patricia's friends on the board had never received citations despite clear violations. Hannah and I became the unofficial leaders of what was now a full rebellion. We organized homeowners, documented violations of HOA bylaws by the board itself, and worked with Sheriff Reynolds to build a case against Patricia and her accomplices. 3 weeks after the incident in my front yard, Patricia and 2 board members were arrested. The charges included embezzlement, fraud, conspiracy, and as accessories to the crimes Williams had committed. The local news featured the story prominently. HOA president arrested in scheme to defraud homeowners, but our troubles weren't over. The remaining board members, though not criminally involved, resisted calls to resign. The HOA bylaws made it difficult to remove them without a supermajority vote from all homeowners, many of whom were disengaged or seasonal residents. "We need to change the bylaws," Hannah said one evening as we sat on my patio reviewing documents. "And we need to run for the board ourselves," I laughed. "Me on the HOA board after all this?" Hannah looked serious. "Who better? You know what happens when power goes unchecked." She had a point. And over the next month, as Patricia and her co-conspirators awaited trial, Hannah and I drafted new bylaws that would increase transparency, limit the board's enforcement powers, and make it easier for homeowners to recall problematic board members. Getting these changes approved required visiting nearly every home in Oakwood Estates. We met residents who'd lived there for years, but had never attended a meeting. We heard countless stories of intimidation and excessive fines. One elderly couple had been paying $200 monthly fines for 3 years because their garden gnome exceeded the permitted lawn ornament height by 2 inches. The community that emerged from these conversations was far different from the disconnected neighborhood I'd moved into. People began talking to each other, sharing resources, and standing up against the remaining board members' attempts to maintain control. On a warm Saturday in June, 2 months after Williams had pointed a gun at me, we held a community-wide vote on the new bylaws. The turnout was unprecedented. 92% of homeowners participated. The new bylaws passed with an 83% approval rate. The remaining board members resigned rather than face a recall vote. And at the election the following week, Hannah and I, along with 3 other reform candidates, were elected to form a new board. Our first act was to dissolve all outstanding fines that couldn't be justified under the new, more reasonable standards. Our second was to hire a forensic accountant to trace every dollar of the misappropriated funds. Sheriff Reynolds called me the day before Patricia's preliminary hearing. "Thought you'd want to know," he said. "Williams took a plea deal. 5 years, eligible for parole in 2. He's testifying against Patricia and the others." "Only 5 years for pulling a gun on someone?" I asked. "For the weapons charge, impersonating an officer, and conspiracy. Given his cooperation and lack of prior violent offenses, it's a reasonable sentence," Reynolds explained. "But Patricia and her sister are looking at up to 15 years for the financial crimes." The prosecutors added racketeering charges based on the pattern of behavior across multiple HOAs. I thanked him for the update, reflecting on how quickly life can change. 6 months ago, I'd been a divorced guy trying to live quietly in a suburban neighborhood. Now, I was leading a reformed HOA and preparing to testify in a criminal case. Patricia's trial began in September. I took my place on the witness stand, describing the events of that April afternoon. As I spoke, I looked directly at Patricia, who sat expressionless beside her attorney. "And when did you realize Mr. Williams was not actually a law enforcement officer?" the prosecutor asked. "Not until he drew his weapon," I answered. "Until that moment, I thought he might be an overzealous rent-a-cop. The uniform looked similar to what you might see on a security guard, but the badge appeared official from a distance." "And what did you do when he pointed his gun at you?" I raised my hands and tried to de-escalate the situation. I was terrified. This was over a mailbox color that was a slightly different shade of blue than specified in the HOA guidelines. The courtroom was silent. Even Patricia's supporters seemed to recognize the absurdity and danger of what had happened. Patricia's defense tried to distance her from Williams' actions, arguing she never instructed him to use force or weapons. But the financial paper trail, combined with Williams' testimony and records of her involvement with similar schemes in other communities, painted a clear picture of corruption and abuse of power. After a 2-week trial, the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Patricia was found guilty on all counts: embezzlement, fraud, conspiracy, and as an accessory to Williams' crimes. Her sentence: 12 years in prison and restitution to the HOA of over $350,000. As fall turned to winter, Oakwood Estates began to heal. The new board, myself included, focused on rebuilding community trust. We held monthly gatherings in the park, created a transparent violation review process, and reduced HOA fees by eliminating wasteful contracts with Patricia's preferred vendors. One crisp December evening, Hannah and I walked through the neighborhood, admiring the holiday decorations that would have resulted in fines under Patricia's reign. Remember when the Martinez family got cited for excessive holiday lighting?" Hannah asked, gesturing toward their house, now gloriously adorned with thousands of twinkling lights and a massive inflatable Santa. I laughed. "And now they won the community decoration contest." Hannah stopped walking and turned to face me. "Are you glad you got involved?" "There were moments I thought you might just sell your house and move." The question made me pause. The past months had been stressful, time-consuming, and at times frightening. But I looked around at the neighborhood children playing freely in front yards, neighbors chatting across driveways, gardens flourishing with previously non-regulation plants, and knew my answer. "Absolutely," I said. "This is what community should be. Not fear and control, but people looking out for each other." Hannah smiled. "Well, your term on the board is only 2 years. What then?" I hadn't thought that far ahead. "Maybe I'll finally finish that back patio project without worrying about getting a citation for unauthorized construction." "I could help with that," Hannah offered, her voice casual but her eyes suggesting something more. Our relationship had evolved gradually through the crisis, from strangers to allies to friends. And lately, perhaps something more. I found myself looking forward to our board meetings and strategy sessions, appreciating her intelligence and determination. "I'd like that," I replied. As we continued walking, a sheriff's department cruiser rolled slowly down the street. Deputy Garcia waved from the driver's seat. The department had increased patrols in our neighborhood after the incident, a genuine security presence rather than Patricia's intimidation tactics. "One more thing," Hannah said, pulling a folded paper from her pocket. "I've been working on this amendment to the bylaws. It would prevent any future board from creating private security forces or armed enforcement." I took the document, scanning the precise legal language Hannah had crafted. "This is excellent. Let's present it at the January meeting." "I already have 12 signatures supporting it," she said proudly. The following spring marked 1 year since Williams had pointed a gun at me in my front yard. The HOA held a community picnic in the park to celebrate the transformation of our neighborhood. Nearly every resident attended, bringing dishes that reflected our diverse community. Sheriff Reynolds stopped by, accepting a plate of food with a smile. "Quite a difference from last year," he remarked, surveying the relaxed gathering. "It's been a journey," I agreed. "You know," Reynolds said, lowering his voice, "we've had inquiries from 3 other neighborhoods about similar situations. HOAs overstepping, suspicious finances, intimidation tactics. Your case has opened some eyes." This was news to me. "Are you investigating?" Reynolds nodded. "And we're developing training for our deputies on how to handle HOA disputes before they escalate. Your situation has become something of a case study." The idea that our experience might help others facing similar situations was satisfying. Hannah joined us, and Reynolds shared what he'd told me. "We should create a resource guide," Hannah suggested immediately. "Something to help homeowners understand their rights within an HOA structure. And know when to call the real police," Reynolds added with a wry smile. By summer, Hannah and I had compiled that guide, working with attorneys, real estate experts, and homeowners who'd experienced HOA abuses. We presented it at a county commissioners' meeting, where it was enthusiastically received and posted on the county website. We also found time to finish my back patio project, working weekends through the spring. As we stained the deck on a warm July day, I reflected on how differently things might have turned out if I'd simply complied with Patricia's demands or moved away. "What are you thinking about?" Hannah asked, noticing my pause. "How a navy blue mailbox changed everything," I replied. She laughed. "It wasn't the mailbox, it was you standing your ground. Perhaps she was right. That evening, as neighbors dropped by to admire the finished patio without worrying about unauthorized gatherings or noise violations, I felt a profound appreciation for the community we'd built from the ashes of Patricia's regime. The quarterly HOA newsletter, once a dreaded list of violations and threats, had transformed into a genuine community resource, featuring gardening tips, profiles of new residents, and a neighbor helping neighbor section where residents could request or offer assistance. During our second year on the board, Hannah and I focused on creating sustainable processes that would outlast our terms. We established an ethics committee composed of residents not on the board, created a transparent budget review process, and limited the HOA's ability to fine residents without due process. Patricia's criminal case had finally concluded with her appeals exhausted. She would serve her full sentence, with the court ordering that upon release, she could not serve on any HOA board or in any fiduciary capacity. The remaining stolen funds were slowly being recovered through the seizure of assets and restitution payments. In October, I received a letter from the Travis County Sheriff's Department inviting me to speak at a training session for deputies about recognizing and responding to HOA abuses of power. Hannah agreed to join me, bringing her legal expertise to complement my personal experience. The training took place in a conference room at the sheriff's office, with about 30 deputies and supervisors in attendance. Sheriff Reynolds introduced us, explaining how our case had revealed a gap in law enforcement's understanding of HOA disputes. Most of us considered these civil matters, Reynolds admitted. We tell homeowners to hire an attorney or handle it through proper HOA channels. But Mr. Hayes' experience showed us how quickly these situations can escalate from civil disagreements to criminal activity. I shared my story, from the initial mailbox citation to the moment Williams pulled his gun. Hannah explained the legal boundaries of HOA authority and warning signs that an association might be exceeding its powers. HOAs cannot imprison homeowners, create their own courts, or use force to ensure compliance, she emphasized. They cannot impersonate law enforcement, restrict constitutional rights, or enter homes without permission or a court order. The deputies asked thoughtful questions, many sharing their own experiences responding to HOA disputes that had turned hostile. We had a case where an HOA president was removing political signs from yards before elections, one deputy recalled. We treated it as trespassing and theft, but never connected it to a pattern of HOA overreach. By the session's end, it was clear our experience was having ripple effects beyond our neighborhood. Reynolds announced that the department was establishing a specialized unit to investigate reports of HOA fraud and abuse, with dedicated training and resources. Sometimes the system works, I remarked to Hannah as we left the training. She squeezed my hand. Sometimes people make it work. As my 2-year term on the HOA board neared its end, I decided not to run for re-election. The systems we'd established were functioning well, and new residents were stepping up to serve. Hannah chose to run for one more term to provide continuity, which I fully supported. Our relationship had deepened throughout our shared mission. What began as an alliance against corruption had grown into friendship, and then something more. We'd begun dating officially 6 months after the trial, though our neighbors claimed they'd seen it coming from the start. The night after the new board elections, Hannah and I sat on my completed patio, enjoying the mild evening. Strings of lights which would have violated at least 3 of Patricia's HOA rules twinkled overhead. So what's next for the hero of Oakwood Estates? Hannah asked, her head resting against my shoulder. I laughed at the title. I'm thinking of starting a consulting business, helping homeowners navigate HOA disputes, reviewing bylaws for potential abuse points, mediating conflicts before they escalate. Hannah sat up, excited. That's perfect for you, and there's definitely a need. I've already had inquiries from homeowners in other communities, I admitted. Word seems to have spread since the sheriff's training. You could make a real difference, Hannah said, and I could help with the legal aspects. The idea of continuing to work with Hannah, helping others avoid what we'd experienced, felt right. I'd like that. In December, exactly 20 months after Williams had pointed a gun at me in my front yard, I launched Hayes HOA Consulting. Hannah provided legal review of materials and occasionally joined me for particularly complex cases. Sheriff Reynolds referred homeowners to me when disputes fell into the gray area between civil and criminal concerns. Our neighborhood continued to thrive under the new governance model. The community center hosted classes, clubs, and events almost daily. Neighbors knew each other by name. Property values had actually increased, disproving Patricia's claim that only rigid enforcement could protect our investments. 1 year after launching my consulting business, I was invited to testify before the state legislature on a bill designed to increase HOA transparency and limit enforcement powers. Hannah helped me prepare my testimony, drawing on both my personal experience and the dozens of cases we'd now consulted on across the state. The fundamental issue, I explained to the legislative committee, is that HOAs have significant power over people's largest investments, their homes, but often operate with minimal oversight. When that power concentrates in the hands of individuals with personal agendas, the potential for abuse is enormous. The bill passed, requiring HOAs to provide financial transparency, limiting their ability to foreclose for minor infractions, and establishing state oversight of associations above a certain size. As I drove home from the Capitol, I reflected on the journey that had begun with a navy blue mailbox. I'd never sought to become an activist or an expert on homeowners' rights. I'd simply wanted to live peacefully in my neighborhood. Hannah was waiting on my patio when I arrived home, a bottle of champagne chilling in an ice bucket. To changing the system, she toasted when I told her about the bill's passage. To standing up to bullies with badges, I replied, clinking my glass against hers. Later that evening, as we walked through the neighborhood, we passed my infamous mailbox, still defiantly navy blue rather than midnight blue. Hannah had suggested painting it the approved color months ago, now that we could do so without caving to Patricia's demands, but I'd kept it as a reminder. You know, Hannah said thoughtfully, in an odd way we should thank Patricia. Without her corruption, we might never have met. This community might still be disconnected, with neighbors afraid to talk to each other, and those other HOAs might still be operating under similar regimes. It was a perspective I hadn't considered. From small rebellions, great changes grow, something like that, she agreed. Though I wouldn't recommend having a gun pointed at you as a strategy for community organizing. I laughed, pulling her close as we continued our walk through the peaceful neighborhood. We'd helped create a place where homes were truly sanctuaries, not subjects of constant scrutiny and threat. 3 years after Williams had attempted to arrest me in my front yard, I received a letter from the prison where Patricia was serving her sentence. My first instinct was to throw it away unopened, but curiosity won out. Mr. Hayes, she'd written in precise handwriting. I've had a lot of time to think about my actions and their impact. While I maintain that my intentions were to preserve our community standards, I recognize that my methods were deeply flawed and ultimately criminal. I cannot undo the fear I caused you or the trust I broke with our neighbors. I am writing not to ask forgiveness but to acknowledge the harm I caused. Patricia Stevenson. I showed the letter to Hannah that evening. What do you think? Genuine reflection or positioning for a parole hearing? Hannah read it carefully. Perhaps a bit of both. People are complex. Maybe facing consequences has given her some perspective. I decided not to respond. Patricia's acknowledgement didn't erase what had happened, but it did provide a certain closure. The system had worked, justice had been served, and our community had emerged stronger. The following spring, Oakwood Estates celebrated 5 years under the reformed HOA structure with a neighborhood festival. Tables lined the community park, laden with food from dozens of cultures. Children played on the newly installed playground equipment, funded by HOA dues that had previously gone to Patricia's security force. Sheriff Reynolds attended with his family, now a friend rather than just an official contact. As we shared a meal, he updated me on William's status. He's up for parole next month, Reynolds said. Completed anger management education programs, the works. His lawyer thinks he has a good chance. How do you feel about that? I asked. Reynolds considered the question. He committed serious crimes, but he served his time and cooperated fully. The system is designed for rehabilitation as well as punishment. I nodded, surprised at my lack of anger. Williams had been Patricia's tool, and while his decision to draw a weapon had been his own, the context of manipulation was clear. As the festival continued into evening, I found a moment alone with Hannah near the community pond. The setting sun cast golden light across the water as children fed ducks with approved birdseed, one HOA rule we'd kept, for the ducks' health. I have something to ask you, I said, suddenly nervous despite our years together. Hannah turned to me, curious. Is everything okay? I took her hand. More than okay. These past few years have been extraordinary, not just because of what we accomplished for the community, but because of what we built together. Understanding dawned in her eyes as I dropped to one knee, pulling a small box from my pocket. Hannah Adams, will you marry me? Her yes was immediate and enthusiastic, drawing applause from nearby neighbors who witnessed the moment. As we embraced, I marveled at how a confrontation over a mailbox had led to finding my partner, reforming a community, changing state law, and creating a new purpose in life. 6 months later, we married in the community park, surrounded by neighbors who had become friends through our shared journey. Sheriff Reynolds attended in a suit rather than his uniform, raising a toast to fighting the good fight. Our honeymoon was briefly interrupted by a call from a homeowner in Houston facing a situation disturbingly similar to what we'd experienced. An HOA president creating a private security force and targeting problem residents. Hannah and I spent one evening of our trip on a video call, providing guidance and connecting them with local resources. Some honeymoon, Hannah joked as we finally ended the call. Helping others while on a beach in Hawaii. I can think of worse ways to spend an evening, I replied. When we returned home, we found that our neighborhood had continued to evolve in positive ways. The community garden had expanded, now providing fresh produce for a local food bank. A resident-led initiative had installed solar panels on the community center. The newsletter featured profiles of neighbors helping each other through hardships. 5 years to the day after Williams had pointed a gun at me, I received an email from a journalist writing a book about HOA abuses across the country. She wanted to interview Hannah and me about our experience and the changes we'd helped implement. Do you ever regret painting that mailbox? The journalist asked during our conversation. I glanced at Hannah before answering. Not for a moment. It led to everything important in my life now. Sometimes standing your ground on a small issue reveals much larger problems that need addressing. The book was published the following year, with our story forming a central chapter. It received national attention, sparking conversations about HOA reform in communities across the country. Hannah and I found ourselves invited to speak at conferences, consult with legislators, and advise homeowners facing similar situations. 7 years after the incident, we welcomed our daughter, Lily. As I held her for the first time, I made a silent promise that she would grow up in a home and community built on respect rather than fear, cooperation rather than control. Williams was released on parole that same year. He moved to another state, and I never heard from him directly. Patricia remained in prison, eligible for parole in 3 more years. The money she had stolen continued to be recovered in small amounts, used to fund community improvements. 10 years after Williams attempted to arrest me in my front yard, Hannah and I still lived in the same house with the same navy blue mailbox. Our consulting business had grown to include a small team of advisors helping homeowners across the state navigate HOA disputes. The Texas legislature had passed additional reforms based partly on our advocacy, and several other states had followed suit. Sheriff Reynolds retired, but remained a close friend and occasional consultant to our business. He often reminded me that my decision to stand up that day had changed far more than just our neighborhood. On the 10th anniversary of the incident, Oakwood Estates held a community celebration that was also a reflection. Many original residents remained, joined by newcomers who had chosen our neighborhood specifically because of its reputation for fair governance and strong community bonds. As I looked around at children playing freely in front yards, neighbors chatting across property lines without fear of citations, gardens flourishing with personally chosen plants, and homes expressing their owner's individuality within reasonable bounds, I felt profound gratitude. "Your mailbox needs repainting," Hannah teased, slipping her arm around my waist as we watched the celebration. "I think I'll keep it just as it is," I replied, pulling her close. "Some rebellions are worth remembering." The navy blue mailbox stood as a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of resistance can create the greatest changes, and that communities thrive not through rigid control, but through respect, transparency, and the courage to stand up when something is wrong.